Hey everyone, welcome back to Reason and Theology, continuing with our playlist on topics related to biblical archaeology. I've called it Reason and Archaeology, play on Reason and Theology. So, plenty of other topics in this playlist if this is the kind of stuff that interests you. By the way, I just did a patron only video on can we know the original Old Testament. I had some people asking me about this question based on a video I did yesterday showing the difficulty with establishing what the original Old Testament books said in light of the manuscripts that are available today and a pretty large gap between when they were written and what we have, and the diversity of manuscripts and various readings that we have. And so people naturally ask the question, well, in light of these difficulties, can we know the original Old Testament? And I talk about that in this video that I just put out this morning. This is one of the benefits for becoming a patron. Whether here on YouTube as a channel member or on Patreon, either way, you get access to plenty of extra exclusive content for patrons only. Go and check that out if this is stuff that interests you and if you want to support the channel. And by the way, I got to ask you, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button while you're at it. Now, let's talk about an aspect about the Dead Sea Scrolls that you've likely never heard, that likely no one has ever told you. It involves a number of things: the Septuagint, the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and some other things. Before I can get into that particular point, what you've likely not heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls that's incredibly fascinating and that you need to know, I have to just recap what these things are. You know, I know I've covered it in previous shows, but for people who are new to the channel and haven't seen those videos, let's just briefly recap. What is the Septuagint? What is the Masoretic text? What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? I actually pulled up ChatGPT to give just a quick breakdown in bullet point style of what these things are. Instead of going into great detail, ChatGPT can be helpful like that. And giving quick summaries of these things. I'll correct ChatGPT a little bit here because it's not always entirely accurate. That's why you cannot rely on ChatGPT. For all of you out there who are doing that, stop doing that. You cannot rely entirely solely on ChatGPT. But if you know what you're doing, it could actually be a useful tool like we're doing here. So what is the Septuagint, abbreviated LXX? It's an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament. So it's a number of translations from Hebrew into Greek of the Old Testament. That's effectively what it is. Produced between the 3rd and 1st century BC for Greek-speaking Jews. And there were a number of reasons why. Various rulers at that time wanted to have a Greek Old Testament to put in their libraries and so on. It's often quoted in the New Testament. So when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, a lot of times it's a Septuagint reading. It's in line with this Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, but not always. Sometimes they are referencing what we'll see next as the Masoretic text. So the apostles or the New Testament writers sometimes use both. Both are seen as legitimate sources of transmission of the Old Testament because both are used by the New Testament. And in some cases, the Old Testament, when it's quoting, the New Testament, when it's quoting the Old Testament, you might not know this, but in some cases, it's not quoting the Septuagint or any other known stream of transmission. It's quoting something that's unique that we just don't know anything about. It doesn't match up with any of the categories of what we know about so far. That's actually going to touch on and relate to what we're going to discuss here with the Dead Sea Scrolls in a moment. But let's get through the basics, right? Let's go through the motions here and recap, review what these things mean. Okay, the Masoretic text, what is that? Standardized Hebrew version of the Old Testament, compiled and preserved by Jewish scribes, Masoretes, around the 7th to 10th century AD. However, you do have this taking place, and this is where ChatGPT fails us, right? At least in this bullet point summary. You do have different stages to a Masoretic text. A stage beginning with the Babylonian exile, the people, who go into exile from the Babylonian captivity, the Jews there. You can speak of a Masoretic text kind of being established there in its first stage, second stage a little bit later on, and then a third stage much, much later in the 7th to 10th century AD. Now, it also includes vowel markings and pronunciation guides. That's by the time you get to the 8th century or so AD. Prior to that, they don't have it, creating a lot of problems in different readings. Okay, it's a basis for most modern Jewish and Protestant Old Testaments. What is the Samaritan Pentateuch? Samaritan Pentateuch is the Samaritan version of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. That's what Pentateuch means, first 5 books of the Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Samaritans, these were people related to kind of northern Israel, had to do with the Assyrian captivity there. Now, the Samaritan Pentateuch preserved in ancient Hebrew script, and it has some theological and textual differences from the Masoretic text. So there are some differences between it and what you have with the Masoretes. It reflects an early textual tradition distinct from mainstream Judaism. And then lastly, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is especially what we're honing in on today. These were discovered near Qumran between 1947 to 1956. There are a number of scrolls, some about biblical texts, others about non-biblical texts. They range between 250 BC to 100 AD. They contain fragments of almost every Old Testament book. The exceptions would be Esther and Nehemiah. And as I've kind of pointed out in the past, some of this stuff is incredibly fragmentary. So you're rarely going to find a complete book of the Old Testament among the Dead Sea Scrolls. You might find that with Isaiah, the Psalms, and maybe a few other books, but most other things, it's going to be fragmentary in nature. And it reveals the textual diversity of Scripture during the Second Temple period. So 400 or 500 years before Jesus on up until 70 AD, you had a wide range of readings of the Old Testament. There wasn't just one Old Testament with one particular reading. There was a wide range, and some of them significantly differed with each other. So Jeremiah, discovered at the Qumran caves, I think of the 4th Qumran cave, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. Jeremiah, in the Septuagint version, is 13% shorter than the Jeremiah in the Masoretic text tradition. So we're not talking about just like scribal alterations. Sometimes you do have that as evident in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're talking about significantly different versions of the same biblical book. Jeremiah is a perfect example. Okay, so that's just by way of recap, so that we're familiar with these terms as we go through what I'm about to show you next. So what am I showing you next? This is from the book by Emanuel Tov, the leading scholar on Old Testament textual criticism. This is Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, 2nd edition. I have invited him on the channel. He hasn't been able to accept as of yet. Seems like he's a very, very busy guy being the leading scholar in this area. But maybe one day he'll be able to accept that invitation. Until then, we're going to rely on his works, such as this text. So if you want to talk about the Old Testament, how how the process of transmission, how we got the Old Testament, various manuscripts that we have that talk about the Old Testament, that reflect the Testament, Old Testament's text, how they might differ with each other. That's all related to textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, and he's like the number one authority in the world on the question. Now, I'm going to page 115 of his book, and I want to show you something fascinating from this, because this is something you've likely never heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's going to be the fourth point that we examine here, but let's cover the first three first. When it comes to the Masoretic text, how often are the manuscripts that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, how often do they align with the Masoretic text versus how often do those Dead Sea Scroll biblical texts align with the Septuagint versus how often do they align with the Samaritan Pentateuch? Those are important questions because they will then lead us to the big surprise, the big thing that you've likely never heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I actually bring this up because I had a commenter, multiple commenters in the chat yesterday saying they prefer the readings of the Septuagint because they say the readings of the Septuagint were corroborated by the Dead Sea Scrolls. Bad argument. And I'll show why here in a moment. I also saw some people say they prefer the Septuagint reading because they're the ones attested to by the New Testament. Also bad argument because you have Masoretic texts also being quoted in the New Testament. It's not a either or thing. You have to recognize the New Testament authors use the Septuagint, they use the Masoretic text, they also use things that are not aligned with any of the above. So it's not an either or thing. Now, how often do the readings of the Dead Sea Scrolls line up with the Masoretic text tradition? That's what he answers here. In accordance with the description on page blah, 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 these texts contain the consonantal framework of the Masoretic text. That's what that funny M symbol means. It means Masoretic text. 1,000 years or more before the time of the Masoretic codices. These texts are exemplified by 1Q Isaiah B. The way that works is when you see Dead Sea Scrolls being referenced, the way they designate them is the first number has to do with what cave they were found in, 1 through 11, I believe. Qumran, Q. And then the name of the text. In this case, it's an Isaiah text. And then which, is it the first one they found, the second one they found? The first one would be A, the second one would be B, because sometimes they're finding multiple copies of Isaiah, for example. So this would be from the first Qumran cave, a scroll of Isaiah, and it's the second one that they found. 1Q Isaiah B, and tables 1 and 2, and by 4Q Jeremiah C. So fourth Qumran cave, Jeremiah, the third one that they found. Now watch this. They have no special characteristics beyond their basic agreement with the Masoretic text. Here it is. These texts comprise some 35% of the Qumran biblical texts. So what does that mean? That means when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ones that are about the biblical text, how often do they align with the Masoretic reading? 35% of the time. 35% of the time. Okay. Next, what about the Samaritan Pentateuch? How often do they align with it? Share my screen. Pre-Samaritan texts, and it gives an example, are described in detail in the book. These texts reflect the characteristic features of the Samaritan Pentateuch. You see the 3 little squiggly lines there? Looks like an Egyptian hieroglyph or something, right? That's the symbol for Samaritan Pentateuch. It says, This group comprises no more than 5% of the Qumran biblical text of the Torah. So if you're looking at Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical texts, how often do they align with something that's in the stream of the Samaritan Pentateuch? 5%. 5% of the time. Okay. Now here's another one. You remember our commenter yesterday said that the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm the superiority of the Septuagint in the Septuagint readings. That's 100% false. Because how often do the Dead Sea Scrolls attest to a Septuagint reading of the Old Testament? It says, although no text has been found in Qumran that is identical or almost identical with the presumed Hebrew source of Septuagint, that's what that funny little symbol means, a few texts are very close to the Septuagint. The texts containing a relatively small number of individual readings that are identical with the Hebrew parent text of the Septuagint are not included in this group. Agreements with the Septuagint are also found in 4Q, Deuteronomy, C, H, and J, but these texts actually belong to group 5. We're going to move on to the next page here real quick. Let me go to it. Here it is. Page 116. Tried to do it in a Paul Harvey voice inflection there, but miserably failed. Page 2. The texts which are close to Septuagint comprise 5% of the Qumran biblical text. 5%. That's right. So you can't say the Dead Sea Scrolls overwhelmingly are testifying to the Septuagint. No, only 5% of the time do the readings of the biblical text from the Dead Sea Scrolls align with the Septuagint. Now, that doesn't mean the Septuagint is wrong. That doesn't mean that the New Testament authors are wrong to use the Septuagint frequently. No, that doesn't mean any of that. But what it does mean is that this isn't some kind of slam dunk for the Septuagint. It's also not a slam dunk for the Masoretic text, because you saw that's only testified to 35% of the time. Certainly not a slam dunk for the Samaritan Pentateuch, because those are only testified to 5% of the time. So what about the rest, right? Yeah, 35% plus 5 plus 5. That's 45%, right? Okay, what about the rest? That's the part that you've likely never heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Did you know that the Dead Sea Scrolls overwhelmingly, when it is testifying to the Old Testament, it has a reading that is not aligned with the Septuagint, the Masoretic text, or the Samaritan Pentateuch? These are non-aligned texts. They don't align with any stream of transmission that we're aware of. We're going to cover this in a second, but let that sink in. That's a big deal. You know what that's like? It's like this. Imagine you only know about Star Wars episode, I guess the way it works is 4, 5, and 6. The first 3 that came out, are they now called episodes 4, 5, and 6? Let's say you only know about the original 3 episodes with Luke Skywalker and Han Solo. You only know about those. There's nothing else that you're aware of. The original trilogy. And so you think in the Star Wars universe, that's all that exists. Just those 3 episodes. What happens when you're confronted with reality? Some discovery that actually there's some other episodes here, right? With young Anakin Skywalker. Then there's all this other stuff that Disney has been putting out, right? then your understanding of Star Wars universe has significantly expanded, right? And that might even change how you go back and look at the original trilogy, because now you've seen the context behind it. That's what has just happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls. If all you were aware of was just these Masoretic manuscripts a few Septuagint manuscripts, you wouldn't even be aware that actually there were other readings of the Old Testament that don't align with any of the above. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found out, wait, there's more here than the original trilogy that we were just aware of. There were other episodes. There were other things going on here. There were other readings of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. It makes you wonder, what else are we not aware of? Right? What else? What other readings of the Old Testament are we not aware of that so far hasn't survived in the manuscript witnesses, in the textual tradition? Makes you wonder. Might we uncover something, tomorrow that doesn't align with any of this and gives a very different reading of some part of the Pentateuch or some part of Isaiah or whatever? If you would have said, no, nothing like that could ever happen, if you would have said that before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you would have been wrong, because the Dead Sea Scrolls just proved that point exactly. So watch this. This is what you've not been told about the Dead Sea Scrolls, most likely. Non-aligned texts. Many texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls are not exclusively close to any one of the texts mentioned above and are therefore considered non-aligned. And you remember I told you at the beginning of this video, there are even some portions of the New Testament that's quoting the Old Testament that's also non-aligned, not aligned with any of the above. They agree sometimes significantly with Masoretic texts against the other texts, or they agree with the Samaritan Pentateuch and or the Septuagint against the other texts, but the non-aligned texts also disagree with the other texts to the same extent. They furthermore contain readings not known from one of the other texts, so that they are not exclusively close to one of the other texts or groups. This characterization is important when one tries to determine the full range of texts current in the Second Temple period, as described in this chapter 3. Usually the employment of the term non-aligned merely implies that the texts under consideration follow an inconsistent pattern of agreements and disagreements with the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Septuagint, as in the case of 2nd Q Exodus AB, and he gives like a whole bunch of examples. But the texts which are most manifestly non-aligned and actually independent are texts which contain readings that diverge significantly from other texts, and he gives some examples. Now, I want to go to the next page real quick and read the last bit here. Where is it? The fact that all these different texts were found in the same Qumran caves probably reflects a certain textual reality in the period between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD, and our reconstruction of the history of the biblical text in that period. This situation is described as textual plurality and variety. At the same time, the greater number of the Proto-Masoretic texts probably reflects their authoritative status, since there's no evidence concerning the circumstances of the depositing of the scrolls in the caves, or concerning their possibly different status in the Qumran sect. No solid conclusions can be drawn about the approach of the Qumranites towards the textual variety. It stands to reason that they did not pay any special attention to the differences of the types described here. What is he saying? He's saying that, the Qumran community, where we get these Dead Sea Scrolls from, they didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to the differences. It just wasn't a big deal for them. And one other, share my screen one more time. These non-aligned texts make up 35% of the Qumran evidence. 35%. So 35% of the time, non-aligned texts. So that is something you've likely never heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's really, in my opinion, groundbreaking information. Not that this is groundbreaking as in new, like we just found it out today. No, this is well known to scholars and has been well known to scholars since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's groundbreaking, I imagine, for most people who watch YouTube and are paying attention to the Dead Sea Scrolls, perhaps on just the internet or something. This is fascinating because, again, to bring us back to the analogy, if all you ever knew of was the first 3 Star Wars videos, that's all your universe consisted of. That's all you know. You don't know that there's all this other stuff going on. You don't know that there's these other characters out there. What's that other character? The really annoying one that everybody hated. Why am I drawing a blank on him? I forget his name. Jar Jar. You're not aware that there's a Jar Jar out there until you discover that, oh, wait, there's another episode here about a young Anakin Skywalker and this annoying friend Jar Jar. And then you find out that there's a Qui-Gon character, right? You only find that out once you discover there are other movies about Star Wars. That's what this is like. If all you had known was what we had available prior to 1947, you would just think the universe of biblical readings, different biblical readings of the Hebrew Old Testament, it was just this. Once we got the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found out actually it's that. There's a way wider range of readings of the Hebrew Old Testament. Further complicates the situation and getting back to the original, but also it leaves you with the question of, wait, what else am I not aware of? Okay, my knowledge went from here to there, but wait, might we discover something tomorrow that will make it even more diverse, that will show us there were actually even more diverse readings of Jeremiah or whatever biblical book? It's possible. Very possible. And the more scholars discover these things, the more they're able to use that data to figure out the transmission of the text of the Old Testament, to maybe figure out what is an original reading, or more likely to be an original reading versus what is more likely to be a corruption of the text by perhaps a scribe. It's a difficult thing to determine. There's other difficulties in determining the originals, what even constitutes an original, what part of the editing process. Tov describes that here. He has a whole chapter dedicated to that question. I saw an interview of him online where he is asked that question. Can we know the original? He says, I don't know if we can know. Don't know. And he's the leading scholar on the question of can we know the or how to construct the original autographs. Now, if you want my thoughts on that, you want my potential solutions to that, I literally just did a video on that earlier today for patrons only. Go and check it out. But you need to become a patron. You need to support the channel if you want to get access to those exclusive content videos. All right. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one. I hope y'all enjoyed this. If you did, let me know in the comment section. If you want to see more videos in this playlist of Reason and Archaeology, happy to do more. I need to hear your feedback, though. So drop a comment, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. We really appreciate your support. And visit me on patreon.com/Reason and Theology to support the channel, or hit join right next to the subscribe button right here on YouTube to become a channel member. All right, that's going to do it. See you later.